He promised a perfect fit because each pair was made from the customer's own hide. In 1894, a cobbler in Colorado named Thomas Holloway took perfection to its darkest extreme. He made boots out of human skin. He promised his customers a perfect fit because each pair was crafted from their very own hide. What started as an obsession with flawless craftsmanship spiraled into a chilling nightmare as Holloway's pursuit of innovation led him to a point of no return. But Holloway didn't realize what he was unleashing. His desire for perfection would cost him more than his sanity. The price of creating the perfect boot was far steeper than anyone could have imagined. Thomas Holloway was not a man who settled for mediocrity. In fact, he wasn't even a man who was content with good enough. He was a cobbler in Colorado, known for his meticulous craftsmanship and an obsession that was quickly becoming legendary. Holloway believed in perfection, the kind of perfection that transcended the ordinary. His boots weren't just footwear, they were an experience. When someone put on a pair of his boots, they didn't just fit, they belonged to the wearer like a second skin. No one could deny the comfort and elegance of his designs. But for Holloway, that wasn't enough. His obsession was never about being the best. It was about creating something flawless, something that no one could ever replicate. But the more he worked, the more he realized there was a limit to what leather and stitching could offer. Leather stretched. It wore down. It never truly adapted to the body's unique contours. His customers, though they praised his work, still returned with complaints. "These boots aren't quite perfect, Holloway," they'd say. "They pinch here, they rub there. You can do better." He had to do better. That feeling of not quite reaching his own standard gnawed at him every day. Each pair of boots, no matter how well crafted, seemed like an incomplete symphony. But there was something Holloway knew deep down. His vision wasn't limited by leather. Leather wasn't enough. He needed something more, something organic, something that could truly mold to the body, that could adapt to the wearer like no material before it. And it was in that moment, in the quiet of his cluttered workshop, that the horrifying idea first came to him. Human skin. It was ludicrous, unthinkable. But the more Holloway thought about it, the more the idea took root. What if he could craft boots that were truly a second skin? What if he could take the human form, flawed as it might be, and perfect it? The skin, he realized, was the ultimate material. It had flexibility, resilience, and most importantly, it adapted to the person who wore it. But the thought unsettled him. Holloway wasn't some monster, wasn't about to cut into people and take their skin for his art. No, that would be wrong even for a man obsessed with perfection. But the idea wouldn't leave his mind. He dreamed of it. He couldn't stop thinking about it. And as much as he tried to ignore it, his vision for the perfect boot kept growing until it consumed him entirely. Holloway began researching. At first, it was casual, just a few articles, a couple of old books from strange places, references to ancient rituals where skin was used for various purposes. It wasn't something anyone in the modern world talked about, and he couldn't help but be both disgusted and fascinated. The skin of animals had been used for thousands of years, but human skin, that was a different matter entirely. But soon, Holloway couldn't stop himself. The more he looked into it, the more certain he became. This was the missing piece, the perfect material. Leather could never compare. No other substance could offer the adaptability and perfection he dreamed of. What Holloway didn't realize was that with each passing day, the line between genius and madness was becoming dangerously thin. One evening, Holloway stood in his workshop, surrounded by half-finished boots, sketches, and tools, his hands trembling with the weight of what he was about to do. He had thought about it for weeks, wrestled with the decision, but now it seemed inevitable. If he didn't try this, he would never be satisfied. Never. The first step, he knew, was finding a way to obtain the skin. But the logistics seemed impossible. Where could he get it? Who would be willing? And who would ever believe such a thing was possible, let alone acceptable? Holloway spent the next few days obsessively, researching, looking for any loophole, any precedent that might make his idea less insane. Then the answer came. It wasn't the solution Head hoped for, but it was a solution nonetheless. Holloway met a man in town, an outcast of sorts, known for his mysterious dealings. This man had a reputation for working with unsavory things. He could get his hands on what Holloway needed. Of course, there would be a price, but Holloway was prepared to pay it. Nothing would stop him now. Holloway's first acquisition arrived in the dead of night. It was a single small piece of skin. The man didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Holloway had the material in his hands, and now he would begin the impossible task of turning it into something beautiful, a perfect boot. At first it went surprisingly well. The skin was more flexible than had imagined. It stretched, it adapted. Holloway worked through the night, stitching the skin carefully, ensuring every detail was precise. As the first pair of boots began to take shape, a sense of triumph surged within him. He was closer to perfection than anyone had ever been before. But as Holloway finished the boots, a strange feeling crept up on him. Something was off. The boots were perfect, yes, but they felt wrong. Holloway inspected the pair again, but there was no denying it. Something about them wasn't right. His heart raced. Had he gone too far? He placed them in the corner of the shop and sat down, exhausted, trying to gather his thoughts. The skin felt too real, too personal. He could almost feel the presence of whoever the skin had belonged to. But he couldn't back out now. He had gone this far. And then, just as Holloway stood up to put the boots on the shelf, he heard a sound, a faint scratching like something rubbing against the floor. He froze. Was it the boots, or was it just his imagination? He glanced around, but there was nothing. Only the boots, sitting perfectly still. But in his gut, Holloway knew something had shifted. This wasn't just innovation. It was something else, and it wasn't done with him yet. Holloway stood in his workshop staring at the boots in front of him. They sat there, almost mocking him with their perfection. The leather was gone, replaced by something far darker, far more personal. The skin had molded, adapted, and stretched in ways Holloway never thought possible. The stitching was flawless, the shape was perfect, but something wasn't right. His hands shook as he ran his fingers over the surface, feeling an eerie cold sensation beneath his touch. The skin seemed to pulse, just faintly. His eyes widened, but he brushed the thought away. It's just my mind playing tricks. But Holloway couldn't shake the feeling that the boots were watching him. There was something unsettling about how they seemed to take on a life of their own. Still, he was on the edge of a breakthrough. These Booch's boots were the result of everything he had ever dreamed of. The perfect fit. It was all worth it, he told himself. All the sleepless nights, the research, the cost, all of it. He could almost hear his customers now, praising him. These are the best boots I've ever had. But Holloway's excitement was replaced with a gnawing sense of dread. He felt his stomach churn. What am I doing? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. Holloway startled, his heart racing. He wasn't expecting anyone. Who would come to see him at this hour? When he opened the door, a familiar face stood before him, the same man who had supplied him with the piece of skin. He was grinning, but there was something in his eyes that didn't sit right. A coldness. Did you make it? The man asked, his voice low, almost eager. Holloway hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the question in his chest. He glanced over his shoulder at the boots, still sitting ominously in the corner. Yeah, Holloway said, his voice barely above a whisper. I did. The man stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room with unnatural interest. Let me see them, he demanded. Holloway reluctantly walked over and picked up the boots, turning them over in his hands as if they were sacred objects. He placed them carefully in the man's hands, his palms sweating with anxiety. The man ran his fingers over the boots, inspecting them closely, and then, with a slow smile, he nodded approvingly. You've done well, Holloway, but there's more you must do. Holloway froze, his heart hammering in his chest. More? The man's smile widened, a glint of something darker in his eyes. The skin you've used isn't just for boots. You need to take it further. There's power in what you're doing, real power. But you must give more. It's the only way. Holloway didn't understand. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality. He wasn't sure if it was the man's words or the boots themselves that were starting to make him feel strange. The air in the room felt colder, heavier. I don't, Holloway started, but the man cut him off. You want perfection, don't you? To create something truly flawless? His voice dropped to a whisper. The more skin you use, the more power you'll have. You're not just crafting boots anymore, Holloway. You're crafting something greater. Holloway felt his breath catch in his throat. What do you mean? What are you asking me to do? The man smiled again, the grin spreading unnaturally wide. You'll see. In time. And with that, he turned and left, his footsteps fading into the distance. Holloway stood there, frozen, as the door clicked shut behind him. The room was silent, except for the low, unsettling hum of his thoughts. The next few days passed in a blur. Holloway couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The boots haunted him, both in his dreams and when he was awake. Every time he looked at them, he felt a growing sense of unease. They were alive in a way he didn't understand. It wasn't just the boots, though. His customers, the ones who had worn his boots, began to act. Strangely, they came back to his shop, their eyes wild, their movements stiff. At first, Holloway dismissed it. They were just tired maybe. But as more people came back, their behavior grew more erratic. One man, a regular customer, came in wearing his pair of Holloway's boots. His face was pale, his skin clammy. When he spoke, his voice was strained, as if he were fighting to control it. "Holloway," the man whispered, his eyes darting around nervously. "There's something wrong with them. I can't take them off. I feel like they're part of me." Holloway tried to act calm, but a sickening knot formed in his stomach. He reached out to touch the boots, but the man jerked back, eyes wide with fear. "You've done something to me," the man said, his voice trembling. "I can't think straight. I can't sleep. Two need them." Holloway's heart raced. He had never seen anyone act this way before, but he also couldn't ignore the truth in the man's words. Something had changed. The boots had changed. They weren't just shoes anymore. They were something else entirely. Panic gripped Holloway as the man turned and left in a hurry, mumbling incoherently to himself. Holloway felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. What was happening? Was it the boots? Had he done something wrong? Or was this just the price of perfection? Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences continued. More customers came back with similar complaints, each one describing sensations of unease, of being pulled by the boots. Some even claimed they could hear whispers when they wore them, voices coming from deep within the leather. Holloway was no longer sure if he was losing his mind or if the boots were actually doing something to these people. It was then that Holloway realized the horrible truth. He wasn't just crafting boots, he was crafting traps that entangled the soul, that corrupted the mind. His quest for the perfect fit had turned into a monstrous nightmare. But even in the face of growing fear, Holloway couldn't stop. The boots, perfect in their design, were everything Head ever wanted, and now that Head tasted the power of creating perfection, there was no going back. The question wasn't whether he would stop, it was how far he was willing to go. And what Holloway didn't know was that the deeper he went into his creation, the darker the consequences would become. Holloway's workshop had become a temple of obsession. It was cluttered with boots, some unfinished, some perfect in their twisted beauty. The strange, almost magnetic pull of the boots only intensified with each passing day. Holloway found himself unable to think of anything else. The thought of creating something flawless, something alive with perfection, consumed his every waking hour. His hands itched to craft more, to make something that could change the world or perhaps even control it. But despite the isolation he felt, there was an undeniable pull towards something else, his customers. They had been gone for days. Some had come in, only to leave in confusion or panic. But then, there was the man one Holloway had been waiting for, a man who would give him the validation he desperately needed, the first true customer who might see the brilliance in Holloway's work, or so he hoped. The door of his workshop creaked open one chilly afternoon, and Holloway looked up from his sketches. There stood a tall, gaunt figure with a weary look in his eyes. He was the type of man who looked like he had lived a hard life. His face was rough, weathered by time and experience, but there was a spark in his eyes. Holloway could tell he wasn't here just for a pair of boots, he was desperate. The man walked in without hesitation, looking at the array of boots Holloway had made. Some were made from leather, but most had human skin, darkened and soft, twisted into grotesque shapes that somehow worked. The man's eyes glinted, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "These boots," he said slowly, his voice low but confident. "They're not like anything I've ever seen. What are they made of?" Holloway's heart skipped a beat. He had expected questions, of course, but hearing it out loud, the truth sent a chill down his spine. "They're made from leather," Holloway lied, barely holding his composure. "But it's a special kind of leather. It molds to your foot. A perfect fit." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical but intrigued. "A perfect fit, huh?" he murmured, taking another step closer to the boots. "And what makes these so perfect?" Holloway hesitated. For the first time, the weight of what he had done seemed to crash down on him. This man, this stranger, had no idea what Holloway had used to make these boots. What if he saw through the deception? What if he realized the truth? Holloway's mind raced, but he quickly pushed the fear aside. "They are designed to mold to the exact shape of your foot," Holloway continued, his voice steady but his pulse quickening. "They will fit you in a way no other boot ever could. The more you wear them, the better they fit." The man studied him for a long moment, and Holloway thought for sure he could hear the man's mind turning, weighing the strange offer before him. Finally, the man spoke. "I'll take a pair," he said, his voice gruff but resolved. Holloway almost didn't believe it. He was buying them? The man reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a wad of cash, and handed it over with no hesitation. "Are you sure you understand what you're getting?" Holloway asked, trying to gauge the man's intentions. He didn't want to appear paranoid. But there was something about this man that unsettled him. The man smiled again. "I'm not a fool, Mr. Holloway. I've been on the run my whole life. A good pair of boots, well, they mean everything." Holloway handed over the boots, his finest creation yet, made from the skin, shaped to fit, to mold. As the man took them, Holloway caught a glimpse of the man's hands, shaking just slightly. But the man didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He took the boots, and without another word, walked out of the workshop. Holloway's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't believe it. He had made the sale. This was a turning point for him, but something gnawed at him, something that said that this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. Hours passed, and Holloway couldn't concentrate. He paced the room, checking the clock every few minutes. What was happening? Why hadn't the man returned? Had promised a perfect fit, hadn't he? Surely, if it was perfect, the man would have come back ecstatic, praising Holloway for his genius. Then, just as Holloway's thoughts reached their boiling point, the door swung open again. It was the man this time. He was walking in quickly, his face pale and covered with sweat. Holloway froze as the man entered. The man staggered toward Holloway, his eyes wild with fear. "You've got to help me," he gasped, collapsing into a chair. Holloway rushed to him, panic rising in his chest. "What's wrong? What happened?" The man's hands trembled uncontrollably as he gripped the boots in his lap. It's the boots," he said between ragged breaths. "I can't take them off. It's like they're part of me. I can't think straight. My feet, they feel like they're alive inside. They won't let me go." Holloway's breath caught in his throat. The man was clearly terrified. Holloway hadn't anticipated this. He hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. The boots had always been his work of art, his masterpiece, but he never imagined they could do this to someone. He tried to remain calm. "You're just adjusting to them. It'll pass. They mold to your foot, that's all. It's normal." But the man's wild eyes said otherwise. "Normal? No, this isn't normal. It's like they control me. I can't stop thinking about them. I can't think about anything else." He took in a ragged breath. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Holloway's stomach churned. What had he done? These were supposed to be the perfect boots. They were supposed to fit like nothing else. They weren't supposed to cause this. "Stay calm," Holloway said, his voice trembling as he tried to collect his thoughts. "We can fix this. I'll help you take them off." But as he moved closer to the man, something else began to happen. The boots began to twitch, ever so slightly, as if they were alive. Holloway recoiled, eyes wide with disbelief. The man screamed as the boots tightened around his legs. "Please take them off. I can't breathe." Holloway tried to pull them off, but they clung to the man's feet like a vice. His attempts were in vain. It was as if the boots had fused with the man's skin. The more Holloway pulled, the more the boots seemed to dig in, tightening, growing even more alive. The man's face was turning pale, his body convulsing as the boots squeezed tighter with every breath. Then, in a final desperate act, the man screamed, the sound echoing through the walls of the shop. And with that scream, the boots snapped. The man collapsed to the floor, lifeless. Holloway stood frozen, his mind racing. He had created something beautiful, but also something terrifying, something beyond his control. The boots had taken this man, and there was no turning back. The chilling truth hit Holloway like a wave. This was only the beginning. Whatever he had started, whatever he had unleashed, could not be contained. The pursuit of perfection had led him to a place where the line between art and horror had blurred, and now there was no escape. The boots were no longer just a work of art, they were something far darker, something he couldn't control. The aftermath of the man's death hung over Holloway like a shadow that refused to fade. His first true customer, the one who had believed in his boots, in his craft, was gone, and Holloway was left standing in his workshop staring at the lifeless body of the man who had come to him seeking perfection. The boots that had been so carefully crafted, so meticulously designed, had taken this man's life. But it wasn't just his life, it was Holloway's soul. For the first time, the cobbler felt the weight of what he had done. The room was silent, save for the sound of Holloway's own breath, heavy and frantic. His hands shook, but he forced himself to look at the boots, still clinging to the man's feet. They hadn't let go. They weren't just boots, they were something else entirely. Holloway reached down, his fingers grazing the edge of the boots, and the feeling of their cold, unnatural texture sent a jolt of fear through his chest. What have I created? His heart pounded as he carefully pried the boots from the man's feet. The skin that had once been so pliable, so adaptable, was now stiff and lifeless, like a hollow shell. As he pulled them off, a sickening crack echoed through the room. Something inside the boots had snapped. Holloway dropped them to the floor, stepping back in shock. They were dead. The boots, once so full of promise, had now become nothing more than lifeless objects, devoid of the energy they had once seemed to possess. But even as he looked at the boots lying in a heap on the floor, something inside Holloway shifted. Was this failure, or was this just a step in his journey to something greater? He couldn't stop now, not when he was so close. The perfect fit was just within his reach, and he would not let anything, not even this, stop him from achieving his vision. Holloway's mind raced. He had created something that had power. But it was power that came with a price he wasn't ready to pay. Still, the obsession burned in him, a flame that couldn't be extinguished. He couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. Over the next few weeks, Holloway's workshop became a prison. He barely ate, barely slept. His only focus was perfecting his craft. The boots he had made before, the ones made from human skin, had been a mistake, he realized. He needed more. He needed better skin, stronger skin, skin that would adapt more perfectly to the human form, skin that could withstand the pressure of his genius. He needed to find new sources, better materials. And that's when the idea hit him. He could use more than one person's skin. He could combine different types of skin, different textures, different levels of strength. This would be the ultimate boot, the perfect boot. As Holloway's obsession deepened, he began scouring the streets for more. He started to find those who were willing to trade their skin for something more. Some were poor, desperate, seeking any kind of escape from the grinding poverty they lived in. Others were sick, forgotten by the world. Holloway didn't care who they were. They were perfect materials for his masterpiece. And with every new acquisition, he grew more convinced that his vision was finally within his grasp. He wasn't just making boots anymore. He was creating something beyond boots. He was creating something eternal. One evening, after yet another grim transaction, Holloway sat in his workshop, his fingers trembling as he stitched the pieces of skin together. He worked quickly, feverishly, desperate to finish. But as he did, a thought crept into his mind, a nagging thought that refused to go away. What if it's already too late? Holloway shook the thought off. It was just fear, the fear of failure. He couldn't afford to let that consume him out when he was so close. He'd already gone too far to turn back. The boots were coming together beautifully. He could already see it a perfect fit. The stitching was flawless, the skin molding together seamlessly. It was as though the pieces were alive, coming together with a will of their own. Holloway's excitement grew as the boots began to take shape, but at the same time, a sickening feeling settled in his gut. What was it that he was truly creating? Just then, a soft knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. Holloway stood up, his body stiff and tense. Who could it be at this hour? His heart raced as he walked toward the door. When he opened it, he was met with a familiar face, a face that had once been eager, full of promise. It was one of his earlier customers, the man who had bought the first pair of boots Holloway had ever sold. The man stood before him, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow with fear. "Holloway," the man whispered, his voice strained. I need help." Holloway's stomach twisted. "What's wrong?" he asked, but he already knew the answer. The boots. It had to be the boots. The man stepped inside, his movements jerky and unnatural. I can't take them off," the man gasped, his hands trembling as he clutched his feet wrapped in the boots. "It's like they own me. I can feel them inside of me. They're alive, Holloway. They're controlling me." Holloway's heart skipped a beat. What had he done? He stepped back, unable to form words. The man was trembling now, as if in the grip of some invisible force. I thought it would be different. I thought it would be perfect." "But it is perfect," Holloway said before he could stop himself. His voice was cold, detached. "The fit, the design, it's flawless." The man's eyes widened with terror. No, you don't understand. It's not just the fit. It's everything. It's inside me, Holloway. It won't stop. I hear them. The boots. They're talking to me." Holloway took a step back, but the man grabbed his arm, his grip tight and desperate. "You have to fix it, please." Holloway yanked his arm away, horrified, but his fascination with the boots began to overpower his fear. They weren't just objects anymore. They were something else, something more. His hands shook as he looked at the man's boots, still clinging to him, squeezing tighter, more violently. Holloway knew the boots were not just a creation anymore. They were alive, and now they were demanding more. The man collapsed to the floor, writhing in agony, as Holloway watched in a mixture of fascination and horror. The boots had taken control of him, and Holloway could no longer deny it. This was no longer about making a perfect pair of shoes. This was about something far darker, something that Holloway could never escape. Holloway's mind spun as he stood in his workshop, staring down at the man writhing on the floor. The terror in his eyes was clear, but there was something else, something Holloway hadn't anticipated. The man was becoming lost. His body jerked, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the boots continued to tighten around his feet, seemingly of their own accord, and Holloway could do nothing. It wasn't just that the boots wouldn't come off. It was that they were changing him. The man's features had begun to distort, his once clear face now contorted with pain. His skin, once normal, seemed to ripple beneath the boots, as if something inside was taking over. Holloway stood frozen, horror dawning in his chest. He couldn't understand what was happening. These boots, his creations, were no longer just shoes. They were something else, something much darker. The man's voice broke through the air, desperate and pleading. "Please, Holloway, I don't want this. There inside my head. I can't think right anymore." Holloway's heart raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. The boots were perfect. They were supposed to bring comfort, to fit like nothing else, but this was something far worse. The perfect fit had turned into a perfect nightmare. "No!" Holloway shouted, backing away from the man. "You're just adjusting. This will pass. The fit, it's perfect. You have to understand, it's part of the process." But Holloway's words were hollow, even to his own ears. The man's twisted features told a different story. The boots were no longer just tight, they were suffocating. The man's body seemed to contort with each breath he took, his movements jerky and unnatural. It wasn't the boots anymore. It was the humanity within them that was being consumed. And then, with a sickening snap, the man's body stilled. Holloway's heart dropped. He stepped forward cautiously, dreading what he might find. The boots, they were gone. The man's feet were bare now, and his once agitated body was silent. He lay motionless on the floor, his eyes open but unseeing, a vacant expression etched onto his face. Holloway's stomach churned as he knelt beside the man, terrified that he had lost him forever. But the terror deepened when Holloway noticed something he hadn't seen before. The man's skin, where the boots had once gripped him, was now covered in strange, dark markings. The pattern was intricate, almost beautiful in a disturbing way, but it wasn't the design that scared Holloway. It was the feeling that this was something alive. The skin itself seemed to move slightly, rippling under Holloway's touch. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just the boots taking hold of a person, it was something more. The skin itself was alive, now bound to the boots in a way that Holloway couldn't understand. Suddenly, Holloway's mind raced with panic. His obsession with creating the perfect boot had blinded him to the true consequences. It wasn't about crafting something extraordinary. It was about crossing a line that no one, not even Holloway, should have crossed. The truth was now clear. He wasn't making boots anymore. He was creating something darker, something that needed to consume. But the deeper Holloway went into this madness, the harder it became to stop. The man's body was a warning. Yes, but Holloway didn't care. His vision for the perfect pair of boots was still alive in him. And now, the line between genius and insanity had completely blurred. He needed more. And so, Holloway sought out new victims, new customers. As his business grew, he became more daring. He didn't just seek out people who wanted boots, he began seeking out the broken, the desperate, the vulnerable. People who would give anything for a pair of boots that fit perfectly. People who had no other option but to trust Holloway's promises. He began to believe that it was all for the greater good, that, in the end, the world would see his work for what it truly was. But the darkness in Holloway's heart grew with each new acquisition. The people who came to him no longer had names, no longer had identities. They were material stools for his art. The boots grew more elaborate, more intricate. They weren't just functional anymore. They were masterpieces built with a cruel precision, an obsession that would not be satisfied. Holloway's life became a blur of transactions, of hands reaching out to him in desperation. Head never felt more powerful. But with each new boot, with each new pair he created, Holloway felt something else, something cold, something insidious gripping his soul. It was when he finished his latest pair, however, that the true horror began to surface. The boots were flawless, almost too flawless. Their shape, their size, their fit, everything about them was perfect. The human skin they were crafted from had melded together into a seamless whole, a thing of beauty that no one could deny. And yet something was off. Holloway felt it in his bones. The boots seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, almost as if they were alive. Holloway's eyes widened as the boots began to move ever so slightly on their own. The door to his workshop creaked open again, and Holloway barely noticed the figure standing in the doorway. He didn't hear the footsteps. He didn't notice the figure approaching him until the voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and cold. "You've gone too far." Holloway's head snapped up, his eyes widening in disbelief. Standing before him was a man he hadn't seen in years, the one who had first introduced him to the darker side of innovation, the man who had whispered the words Holloway had tried to forget, the man who had given him the knowledge of how to perfect his craft. "You," Holloway whispered, his voice shaking. "You were the one who showed you the path, yes." The man's eyes were cold, calculating. "But I didn't show you the price of walking it." Holloway stood frozen, a cold dread creeping into his chest. What had he done? "You think you've perfected it, don't you?" "These boots," the man said, gesturing toward the pair Holloway had just finished. "They're alive. They're not just boots. And the more you make, the more you'll feed the thing inside them, inside you." Holloway's mind raced. He hadn't realized Ith hadn't understood the true cost, but now, standing there, the reality hit him like a sledgehammer. The boots were not just his creation. They were a trap, feeding on everything Holloway had become. They had no use for perfection. They had their own agenda. "Stop, Holloway," the man said, his voice full of dark finality, "before it's too late." But Holloway didn't hear him. The obsession, the drive for perfection had consumed him completely. His vision was no longer just about boots. It was about something far darker, far more powerful. The boots weren't his masterpiece. They were his master, and they had already begun to take over. Holloway couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, all he saw were the boots, the same pair that had nearly taken the man's life, the same pair that had grown tighter, more alive, more dangerous with each passing day. The boots had done something to him, something he could no longer ignore. He had crossed a line that he could never return from. His work, once so carefully crafted, was now spiraling out of control. But the worst part? Holloway couldn't stop. He had created them perfect pair of boots. No one could make something like this. They were the pinnacle of his obsession, his genius. But the more he worked, the more he realized he had made something that was no longer just footwear. These boots were a force that wanted something, a force that couldn't be controlled. It wasn't just his customers who were changing. The boots were changing too. Holloway's hands trembled as he worked, each stitch feeling more like a sacrifice than a craft. He had stopped sleeping, stopped eating. His body was becoming a hollow shell, just like the boots, just like the skin that now formed their essence. Holloway had once dreamed of creating something perfect, but he had overlooked the most fundamental truth of all perfection was a curse, and the boots had made were a manifestation of that curse. He worked through the night, his fingers moving of their own accord, stitching and cutting, piecing together new creations. The room was suffocating, the air thick with dread. Each boot felt heavier than the last, each piece of skin more reluctant to yield to his design. Holloway's mind wandered. The more he obsessed, the more he started to see things, shadows moving at the edge of his vision, whispers in the dark corners of his mind. He wasn't alone anymore. The boots had made sure of that. Then, on the third night of his feverish work, it happened. Holloway was stitching the last seam when he heard Ida's soft, scratching sound. Faint, but unmistakable. It came from inside the boots, as though something was moving within them. Holloway's blood ran cold. He had made mistakes before. But this was something new. He tried to pull away, but the boots shifted, the seams twisting, almost as if they were trying to grab him. He jerked back in horror. The boots hadn't just fit someone. They had taken something. Holloway realized, too late, that he had created a gateway and opening for something far darker than he could ever have imagined. The scratching became louder. The boots shuddered as if they were alive. Holloway's breath caught in his throat. He scrambled to remove the boots, to tear them apart, but his hands betrayed him. He couldn't move fast enough. The room began to close in on him, the walls tightening as if the air itself was being sucked into the boots. Holloway stumbled back, falling into a chair, his mind racing. That was when it happened. The boots cracked open with a sound that made Holloway's blood run cold. The air in the room turned frigid, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that his breath misted in the air. From the seams of the boots, a dark shape began to emerge like a shadow taking form. Holloway's eyes widened in disbelief as the figure materialized, its features barely visible, a twisted, contorted shape that looked as if it had been pulled from the deepest corners of his mind. The shadow stepped out of the boots and moved toward him, its presence suffocating, a weight pressing down on Holloway's chest. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. It was as if the very air was alive with hunger for something he couldn't comprehend. "Holloway," a voice rasped, a voice that didn't belong to any living being. "You've created me. You've created me." Holloway's body froze, his limbs refusing to obey. The figure loomed over him, its face coming into focus, an abomination of human features twisted and distorted beyond recognition. Its eyes glowed with a cold, hollow light, and as it spoke again, Holloway felt his very soul recoil. "You wanted perfection," it hissed. "You wanted to mold life into your image. Now you will see what happens when you take more than you should." The figure reached out, its hand impossibly long and slender, the skin stretched tight, and Holloway gasped in terror as the figure's fingers brushed his cheek. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He had created something that had come to life in the most unnatural, horrific way possible. The figure leaned in closer, its breath icy and unnatural. "You thought you were in control, Holloway, but you've only made the mistake of inviting what you can't control." In that moment, Holloway knew. He had been making more than boots. He had been forging chains that bound him to the darkness. These boots, these perfect creations, had been meant to fit the human form, to complete the body, but instead, they had bound the souls of those who wore them, drawn them into something far worse than death. Holloway hadn't just been crafting shoes, he had been creating a prison that would never release its captives. The shadow figure stepped back, and Holloway, barely able to hold on to his sanity, tried to rise. He needed to run. He needed to escape. But the figure's voice stopped him cold. "You cannot escape," it said. "You are the creator. You are bound to your creation." Holloway's eyes darted around the room, his mind racing. Escape, but how? He had brought this curse into the world, and now there was no undoing it. The boots, the skin, the twisted life they had given birth to, all of it was his doing. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But in his desperation, Holloway finally understood something. The figure before him was not his enemy, it was his punishment. The more he tried to escape the consequences of his actions, the tighter the grip of his creation became. The only way out was to destroy it. He reached for the boots, trembling, his fingers brushing the edges of the human skin. It felt wrong, unnatural, but Holloway knew what had to be done. He could just destroy the boots he needed to destroy the curse itself. The shadow would not let him go until he did. With every ounce of strength he had left, Holloway tore the boots apart. The shadow screamed in agony, its form flickering and warping as the boots ripped apart, their power unraveling. The room shook as the figure's presence began to fade, but it wasn't enough. The more Holloway tore, the more the shadow fought back, its will stronger than Holloway's. And then, just as he thought he would lose everything, his sanity, his soul's boots disintegrated into dust. The shadow let out a final scream, its form crumbling away, leaving Holloway standing alone in the room, panting, drenched in sweat. The silence that followed was deafening. Holloway sank to his knees, his body racked with exhaustion. He had destroyed the boots, he had ended the curse. But the cost was unimaginable. He had crossed the line, and now there was no going back. The shadow had faded, but Holloway knew he would never escape the consequences of what he had done. For he had created more than just boots. He had created a legacy of darkness that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The days blurred together in Holloway's mind, each one an indistinguishable repeat of the last. The workshop, now quiet after the destruction of the boots, was no longer a place of creation, it was a prison. The silence that filled the room suffocated him, choking the life out of his spirit. He had torn apart the boots, ended the nightmare he had so carelessly birthed. But the cost was more than just the loss of his sanity, it was the loss of his very sense of self. Holloway had been consumed, body and soul, by his obsession, and now, even in the aftermath of destruction, he could not escape. The shadows in the corners of his mind grew longer, twisting into things that lurked just beyond his consciousness. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows made him jump. He was constantly on edge. It's not over, he told himself. It's never over. He could still feel them, those boots, those perfect boots. They were gone, yes, but in his mind they remained, haunting him, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into his own madness. He had thought he was free. He had thought destroying the boots would end it, but Holloway had made the mistake of believing that the boots were just objects. They weren't. They were something much more insidious. The boots had been the vessel, the doorway for something much darker, the act of creating. Them, of using human skin to mold perfection, had invited something evil into the world, something Holloway had never imagined could exist. Days turned into weeks, and Holloway's paranoia intensified. He could feel it watching him, something watching him. It wasn't just the dark corners of his mind playing tricks on him. He was certain of it now. The boots, or whatever had lived within them, had not truly gone away. They were still there, somewhere, lingering in the very walls of his workshop, in the very air he breathed. Holloway's thoughts twisted, spiraling deeper and deeper into the abyss. He tried to ignore it at first, to rationalize it away. It was just his mind, his guilt, eating away at him. But the more he tried to push it aside, the stronger the feeling became. The boots were gone, but their legacy, their curse, had imprinted itself on him. He had created something no one should ever create, and now he would have to pay the price. The feeling began as an itch in the back of his mind, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, calling to him, telling him to look again, to go back. It was like a voice, deep inside his head, urging him to open the door to the back room where the destroyed boots had once been stored. It had been weeks since Head gone in there. The room was still, untouched, but the temptation was too strong. Holloway needed to know what had he really destroyed. He stood at the door for what felt like an eternity, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He was trembling, but his feet, as if on their own accord, stepped forward. The door creaked as he opened it, revealing the dark, cluttered space where he had once crafted his masterpieces. The room was suffocatingly quiet, but Holloway could hear the faintest scratching sound from somewhere in the darkness. Holloway's heart hammered in his chest. He stepped further into the room, his eyes straining to make out shapes in the dim light. The shadows seemed to move, twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. He stepped closer to the workbench, where the boots had once sat in perfect, terrible beauty. But there was nothing there now, just broken tools and the remnants of his failed creation. Yet the scratching continued. Holloway's skin crawled, every hair on his body standing on end. "What is that?" he whispered to himself, his voice cracking. He stumbled toward the corner of the room, where the sound seemed to be coming from, and his eyes locked onto something small, half hidden under a pile of rags. He knelt down, his hands trembling as he pulled away the fabric. What he saw sent a chill through his Bonessa's small piece of skin, unlike anything he had ever seen before. It was dark, almost black, with strange markings, faint and pulsing as if it were alive. The tattoos on the skin were intricate, a twisted pattern that Holloway recognized instantly. It was the same pattern that had appeared on the man's body before he dyed the markings from the first pair of boots. Holloway's heart dropped into his stomach as he realized the horrifying truth. The boots had never truly been destroyed. They had shifted, evolved, burrowing deeper into his creation. They had recreated themselves, and now they were calling to him, beckoning him back. With shaking hands, he picked up the piece of skin. It was warm. He could feel it pulsing under his fingers, as if it were alive, as if it wanted to be used again. Holloway gasped, his mind racing. "No," he muttered, his voice weak. "No, this isn't possible." But it was. The skin wasn't just a material. It was alive, and it had never left. Holloway's greatest mistake had been assuming that he could control it and he could contain it. The boots weren't just a pair of shoes. They were a vessel, a doorway to something far darker, something Holloway had invited into the world when he first crafted that perfect pair. But there was more. As Holloway's hand trembled over the piece of skin, the whispering began again, louder this time. It wasn't just in his head, it was coming from the skin. The voice grew stronger, more insistent, urging him to act, to finish what he had started. And Holloway felt the pull, the desire to obey, to create, to perfect. It was then that Holloway understood. He wasn't just obsessed with creating the perfect boots. He had become bound to the boots. He had created something that he could never escape. His soul, his very being, was trapped in the work he had created. He was no longer in control. The boots, the creation, had taken on a life of their own. They were no longer bound by Holloway's hands. They were alive, and they were calling to him. Holloway fell to his knees, his breath shallow. The whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else. He was no longer his own. He had become part of the creation. His own obsession had damned him. In that moment, Holloway knew there was no escape. The boots had claimed him, and now they would claim the world. He had crossed the lineage, now he would pay the ultimate price. The walls of Holloway's workshop seemed to close in on him. He was no longer just a man consumed by his craft. He was a prisoner of it. The whispers never stopped. The boots, now nothing more than a haunting memory, had left an imprint on him that he couldn't escape. His mind, once sharp and full of vision, had become a labyrinth of fear and obsession. Holloway had long since stopped seeing the line between reality and madness. He no longer cared to make that distinction. But what terrified him more than anything else was the creeping sensation that the world outside his workshop was beginning to notice. He had been so wrapped up in his work that he had ignored the rumors, the whispers of his creation. The first signs came from the town. The people who once praised his craftsmanship now avoided him with eyes filled with suspicion. Holloway's reputation, once spotless, had turned to ash. And soon, it became clear that the authorities were closing in. It started with small things, an anonymous letter warning him of an investigation, then a visit from an officer asking him questions. Holloway's pulse quickened. The questions weren't about his craft, they were about the disappearances, the missing people, the strange behavior of his customers. Holloway denied everything, but the fear in the officers' eyes said it all. They knew something was wrong. But Holloway didn't care about the law anymore. He didn't care about anything. All that mattered was his work, his art, the perfect boots. Days later, the authorities returned, this time with force. They stormed his shop, searching through every corner, tearing through the wreckage of his failed creations. Holloway didn't resist. He watched, helpless, as they uncovered the horrors he had spent so long hiding. The pieces of human skin, the unfinished boots, the strange markings. It all came out, one piece at a time, each discovery more damning than the last. The officers were disgusted, horrified by what they found. Holloway's heart raced, but in that moment, a sick part of him didn't care. He felt detached, as if he were watching someone else's life unravel. His obsession had consumed him so completely that he no longer feared the consequences. The boots had claimed him, and now they would claim the world. They found the bodies, or what was left of them. Holloway hadn't been careful. He had been too focused on creating, on perfecting his craft. He hadn't noticed how the world around him had started to collapse, and now it was too late. The damage was done. As the officers placed him in handcuffs, Holloway felt something stir inside him. Not fear, not guilt, but a strange sense of relief. It was as though the weight of the world had finally fallen from his shoulders. His work was done. The boots would never be made again. The world would know the truth. But just as the officers began to lead him out of the workshop, a final bone-chilling realization hit Holloway. The whispers, they weren't gone. The boots, the perfect creations, were still there. He could feel them calling to him from the dark corners of his mind. Holloway froze, his eyes darting around the room, searching for something, and then he saw it, in the corner of the workshop, where the boots had once stood. There was something new, a pair of boots, perfect in every way. They shimmered in the dim light, their surfaces flawless, their fit alive. Holloway's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't made them, he hadn't touched them, yet there they were, waiting for him. The officers didn't notice. They didn't hear the whispers, the scratching, the low hum that filled the room. But Holloway did, and he realized with a horrifying clarity that the boots were never just boots. They had always been something more. They had taken him, and now they were taking the world. His mind fractured. The last shred of his sanity snapped. The officers dragged him toward the door, but Holloway couldn't stop staring at the boots, at the creation that had consumed everything he had once. In. As the door slammed shut behind him, Holloway heard the whisper again, louder now. It wasn't in his head. It was in the boots. It was in everything. "You are ours now," the voice hissed, "and so is the world." Years passed since Holloway's arrest. The once promising Cobbler, consumed by his obsession with perfection, was now nothing more than a fading memory. The town had moved on, trying to erase the horror of what had happened. But some stories, no matter how much time passes, never truly fade away. Holloway's name was still whispered in the dark corners of Colorado, and the memory of his creation, the boots made from human skin, lingered like a stain on the town's history. The workshop, now abandoned, stood as a monument to Holloway's twisted genius. The police had sealed the doors, but curiosity never truly dies. Every now and then, someone brave or foolish would try to break in, to uncover the truth for themselves. But they never found what they expected. The boots, the bodies, the remnants of Holloway's obsession, they were gone. But the boots had left something behind. It began with a rumor. A man who had been traveling across the country found a strange pair of boots in an old, forgotten pawn shop in the middle of nowhere. They were perfect, unlike anything he had ever seen. He bought them, thinking they were just another relic of the past, but when he tried them on, something strange happened. The moment he slipped his feet into the boots, he felt different. His thoughts began to slow. His actions grew stiff, and he couldn't stop thinking about the boots. The man disappeared days later, his body never found. The boots were the only thing left behind. The whisper of the legend began to spread again. The perfect boots had returned. But this time, Holloway's name wasn't attached to them. People believed the boots were cursed, a relic of an age that had passed. Others, desperate and hungry for something beyond the ordinary, came to seek out the boots, drawn to their perfection, to the promise of a flawless fit. What no one knew was that the boots weren't just artifacts. They were a legacy. And that legacy was growing stronger, spreading like an infection. Every person who wore them became part of something greater, something darker. But it wasn't just the boots that had survived. Holloway's twisted obsession, his need for perfection, had become something far more insidious. It had shifted. It had become an unholy force, lingering in the air, in the very places where the boots had once been. The whispers never stopped. They waited for someone to listen. They waited for the next victim. And so the story continued. Holloway's name faded from history, but his work lived on. His boots, once his pride, had become the curse he had never anticipated. They were perfect, yes, but they were also the perfect weapon, a weapon that would never stop, never rest, until it had claimed everything. In the end, Holloway's creation was never destroyed. It simply evolved, and it was. Only a matter of time before someone else fell victim to it, someone else would find the boots, and the cycle would begin anew. Years after Holloway's fall, the town had tried to move on, but the echoes of his creations never truly faded. The boots had disappeared, but the legend of Holloway the Cobbler, who made boots from human skin, remained. His name was spoken in hushed tones, a warning wrapped in curiosity, but no one could have predicted that the story wasn't over. The darkness that Holloway had unleashed was still very much alive, and it had found a new way to survive. It began when a young man named Samuel came to town. He was a collector, a man obsessed with finding rare, forgotten artifacts. He had heard the whispers of the cobbler's work and was determined to uncover the truth. The idea of perfect boots, boots that could mold to the wearer's feet in an almost supernatural way, captivated him. He didn't believe the rumors she thought they were just stories, but deep down, Samuel felt an undeniable pull toward them. He needed to see the boots for himself. He found the workshop hidden behind overgrown vines and layers of dust, standing as a forgotten relic. The door creaked open, and Samuel stepped inside. The air was heavy, thick with the remnants of Holloway's obsession. The floorboards groaned beneath his feet as he ventured deeper into the darkened space. At first, he found nothing but the remains of Holloway's madness-sold tools, broken leather, and abandoned sketches. But then, in the far corner of the room, Samuel's eyes locked onto something he hadn't expected. A pair of boots tucked away beneath a sheet, untouched and perfect in their form. They glimmered in the dim light, a promise of something more. He approached them cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. These were it. These were the boots. He couldn't believe it. He had found them legendary boots, the work of the man who had become a myth. He knelt down, reaching for them, his hands trembling. As his fingers brushed the surface, something stirred. A soft, almost imperceptible movement rippled through the boots, as though they were alive. But Samuel, driven by greed and obsession, didn't hesitate. He slipped his feet into the boots, and the moment he did, the world shifted. The boots seemed to bond with him, as though they had always been made for him. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever felt, perfect, all-encompassing. He stood, taking a step. The boots molded to his feet, becoming part of him. At first, it felt incredible. The boots were perfect. But then, a strange, creeping sensation began to settle in. Samuel's thoughts became clouded. He couldn't focus. The world around him seemed to blur, as if the boots were pulling him away from reality. He tried to remove them, but they clung to him with unnatural strength. His hands shook, panic rising in his chest. No, this wasn't what he had imagined. Suddenly, the room grew colder. A shadow flickered in the corner of his. A vision. And then the whispering began, soft at first, like the wind through the trees, but quickly growing louder. Samuel's heart raced as the voice, familiar and cold, filled his mind. "You should never have put them on," the voice hissed. "You thought you could control perfection, but perfection controls you." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and with them came the unmistakable feeling that he was no longer alone. The boots tightened around his feet, their grip becoming painful, their shape shifting as if something inside them was alive, consuming him. In his panic, Samuel fell to his knees, trying to claw at the boots, but his fingers couldn't grasp the soles. The boots had fused with him. He was no longer in control of his own body. His thoughts were no longer his own. He could hear Holloway's voice in the back of his mind, the same voice that had whispered to him in the workshop, "You created me. You are the creator of your own destruction." Samuel's last conscious thought was one of horror, as he realized the truth. Holloway had never truly been the creator. The boots were the creation, and they had created him. Holloway had merely been a vessel, a conduit for something much more ancient and powerful. The boots didn't just make perfect footwear, they made perfect monsters. And now Samuel was one of them. As the whispers swallowed him whole, Holloway's legacy continued, living on through those who were foolish enough to seek perfection in its purest, most twisted form. The boots, once thought to be destroyed, had only evolved. And now, they had a new victim, a new host. Samuel was just the latest in a long line of those who had fallen prey to the unyielding pursuit of Holloway's twisted vision. The cycle would never end, not until perfection had claimed everything.